I'm Judd Myers.
I'm Scott Tipton.
Welcome to Blast Off. Welcome, everybody, to the Blast Off podcast. This is another conversation show. I'm Judd Myers.
I'm Scott Tipton.
And we're here today to talk about our coming guest on the show. Our next guest is someone who is obsessed. That's how I'd like to put it, obsessed. He's obsessed with the structure of storytelling. This is a guy who all he does is watch, listen, write, compose, put things in some kind of structure. And all he does is talk about how story goes together, how it fits, the puzzle of story. He's such an interesting guy who's led so many different lives. He truly wears a lot of hats. But always, no matter what he's doing, it's what's the fable behind this? Where is the fantasy? And the hero's journey is a part of everything. Jim Krueger is someone who everyone respects because of his obsessions.
It's funny, there are some books you read, and it's a time where you've never heard of the author before, and you never heard of the writer, and you don't come in with any sort of like baggage or any sort of preconceived notions. And the first time I ran across Jim Krueger's work was on Earth X from Marvel. And here was a book that was, it was the first major project for Alex Ross after Marvel's at Marvel. And so expectations were high. And people were kind of expecting more of the kind of book that Ross had done before, with this kind of like loving tribute to the Silver Age. And what Krueger gave us was this equally loving subversion of that Silver Age with this kind of dystopic future that still it rang true to everything I loved about Marvel Comics in the 60s and 70s, to the point that even though I didn't hit all of my nostalgic points, it just felt so true. It felt like it belonged in that storyline.
Yeah, I agree. I love that. And of course, moving forward to Justice, which won an Eisner Award, his work with Alex Ross, his collaborations really is something that I love touching on in the interview. You always know when someone is passionate and artistic and has a sense of empathy, when the people that they work with constantly want to continue working with them.
Yeah.
And Jim just basically, he's about the story. He doesn't want people to see behind the scenes. He just wants people to get lost in it. And that's kind of what happened in this interview. I think we both kind of got lost in it, and I hope that you will too. Today's guest is one of the most important modern comic book writers in the business. Working with industry icon Alex Ross, he created the highly acclaimed Earth X trilogy from Marvel Comics. The duo then reunited at DC Comics and produced the Eisner Award-winning epic, Justice. His writing has given voice to the X-Men, the Avengers, Spider-Man, Batman, Buffy, and he even put his feet into the Star Wars comic book universe because, well, why not? Independently, he began publishing his own work. Foot Soldiers, recently reprinted and re-released by Image Comics, is a wonder of storytelling, bringing in a wealth of the most talented artists in comics to tell a post-apocalyptic punk rock superhero epic that manages to be warm-hearted and nostalgic all at the same time. His original graphic novel, High Cost of Happily Ever After, turns the fairy tale damsel in distress genre on its head, and his latest book, The Runner, will just plain scare the hell out of you. He is a writer, he is a director, he is a producer, he is Jim Krueger. Jim, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate it. Since we started this podcast, I've really wanted to get you on here, so I've trapped you now.
No, so happy. I love you, Judd. I love Blast Off.
Well, we obviously love you too. So I want to, very quickly dig in here and start by going back into the Krueger archives and let people know a little bit about your beginnings and your processes. I start every one of my podcasts with a very important question, which I think is indicative of who each personality is. And that is, tell me about the first comic book that you remember reading that affected you so much that you cannot forget it.
There are a number of firsts, because I know that my first comic book was a Superman comic, which I got on a train ride, ultimately on the way to Disney World, and I was so pissed off because my younger brother got Batman. That's all I remember.
There was no sharing between
That's all I remember. I think I even remember the issue having a Human Target backup in it. And I liked Human Target.
So when was this? In the 70s?
Yeah, late 70s.
You got it on a train, but you must have gotten it before you got on the train, or was there...
Right. I think, well,
a newsstand?
The family we took a giant trip to Disney World by train from Wisconsin. And so, we took a small train from Milwaukee to Chicago, and then in Chicago there was like a newsstand there at a train station, which for a Superman comic totally makes sense.
Do you remember the story, or...
Not at all.
No,
not at all. Which is why I say it was a Superman comic, but you said, what's the first one I remember reading? And I think the first one I remember really reading and devouring, it was, I think, Commandy number 8. It was the Jack Kirby King Kong issue.
Well, that explains a lot. It explains a lot about your work.
I'm sure it does. But what I should say is how I got it, how I received that comic probably speaks to why I still love them, why it's never just comics to me. You see, my dad had a garage, and he would come home. He had a garage, and he'd go on tow jobs, and he'd come home and have all the lights swirling and pick me up at home, and he would take me, even as like a 4, 5, 6-year-old, on his tow jobs with him, because it was fun to ride in a truck, and there was really no job for me to do other than to go along. Maybe he'd have me hold a dirty rag after he had finished hooking up a car or something. But for payment, he would always give me a comic book.
And this was in Wisconsin?
And this was in Wisconsin.
Okay. So you come from a blue-collar, red state background.
That's all I'm saying.
Did your parents encourage your comic book reading? Was it, or were they happy that you were reading a lot, or were there novels involved?
Well, my dad encouraged it, because especially those first couple of years, he would buy them for me. But my mom certainly wanted me to read regular books. But there wasn't a Harry Potter when I was growing up. There wasn't, there weren't the things, and they really didn't know necessarily what books to bring to me. I find like all those books I read now, all the YA series of unfortunate events, Harry Potter, that's all the stuff I read now.
I remember my father bringing home comics from the spinner rack at 7-Eleven or whatever, and I was always excited to see, what he brought me home. And inevitably, there was always one that he didn't remember he got it. He just picked another one from the spinner, and he got me 2 of them. So I'd go, thanks, Dad. Yeah. And then I'd go, I've got 3 of these now, hoping that he'd bring me a new one,
I miss the idea of going to the spinner rack and not knowing what you were going to find. Or knowing that there were comics that you were hoping the next issue would come out for, and not knowing if it was going to come to that particular drugstore's spinner rack.
Right.
Like, I remember, again, and this isn't just about my dad, but I remember one afternoon us driving around Milwaukee and checking out maybe 7 or 8 different drugstores until I found that Fantastic Four number 200.
I love your dad so much.
I know.
So great.
It was amazing. I mean, it's rare that we would go on such a search, but it was Fantastic Four 200.
That's so great. A lot of guests have said to me that even back then, they knew they were going to be somehow involved in the world of creativity, whether it be in comics, or they wanted to be in comics, or as an artist, or something like that. And it seems to be a theme that many of them knew in some way, even back then, that they wanted to pursue that line. Did you think that? When you were reading comics and science fiction novels and things when you were a kid, did you go, I think I want to try to do this? Or did you think, you didn't even know that was a possibility?
Yeah, it was not at all. I mean, I would have never guessed. I just thought I was going to get a regular job. And, when I went to college, I did get a journalism degree with a marketing degree. And
At Marquette.
And I thought I was just going to go into advertising, which I did for a couple years in Wisconsin. But, I was, even the type of advertising I was doing in Wisconsin, it was very agricultural related. I got to do funny things. Like I did stuff that won a couple awards, even though those jobs never lasted long. But I won awards for the Coho Fishing Derby outside of Sheboygan. And that was, I think that was like the beginning of me learning how to break rules. I think that was the beginning, because I remember part of it was with the Rotary Club there, and I had to write the ads and take them to the Rotary Club, but I decided not to take them to the Rotary Club because I thought they wouldn't like them, but these were great ads. So you would come into a very, and I don't say conservative politically, I'm saying conservative, a very family-friendly environment. And all of a sudden you'd see billboards that would say, keep your fly open for 3 days in August, or hang out with the local hookers, and stuff like that. And it was these notorious ads that everyone was like, oh my gosh. But they won awards, and
Sure.
The Rotary Club in the end was really happy with the work as an agency that we did.
Well,
so it was all good.
Any press is good press.
Yeah.
Getting people's attention.
And then when those jobs ended, that's when I was like, look, what do I know better? There's nothing I know better than Marvel Comics or DC Comics or the comic industry. So I wrote a number of ads for myself and began systematically every 3 or 4 days sending them to Marvel Comics. And then finally my portfolio. And I pretty much so, because there were really good people there in the advertising department, they brought me on.
Basically, you just didn't take no for an answer. You were going, I want to work there, and I'm going to.
I guess no was always an option, but I guess I was so excited about just even these ads for myself that I was writing. One of them had a picture of a Todd. I took a scan of a Todd McFarlane Spider-Man with a big word balloon coming out of his mouth, and I whited out the word balloon so it was blank, and then that card would open up, and there would be a tag from me saying, I think we both know what's missing, Jim Krueger, copywriter. And then I sent another one that said, and these are true stories, in the past 6 months, I've witnessed a beating, found homeless living in my basement, and been held at gunpoint. And then it opened up and said, I think I'm ready for New York. Jim Krueger, copywriter.
Oh, wow.
And there were a number of these, and I think the final one was the one where I was kind of iffy on. It said, the front said, I hear you're looking for someone to write copy in your advertising department. And it opened up and said, copy in your advertising department. Am I hired? Jim Krueger, copywriter. So it was all this stuff. And then with my advertising portfolio, I sent it all. And Marvel was like, oh, Jim, all this work is great. And you're right. We think we're going to have an opening maybe in 3 months. So we'll keep all your stuff on hand. And I was like, well, in the meantime, if I come out, can we do a meeting? And I'll pick up my portfolio that I sent to you anyhow. And they were like, yeah. So I went out, crashed with someone I had met at a Comic-Con who also worked at Marvel. And that guy was kind of my champion at Marvel. His name was Jeff Simons, really good guy. And he brought me in. And like literally a month later, I was moving to New York to work for very little money for Marvel as a junior copywriter.
Okay. And how long did it take you to move from junior copywriter up to you were a creative director?
Yeah, pretty much so 7 years. That's what it was. Like I think after the first 6 months, I became a regular copywriter. And then I became, senior copywriter, and it just moved from there. And we did amazing stuff. I think we pissed off the competition a number of times with our campaigns and the whole. I don't know if you remember the Marvel versus DC, the giant thing where it was going to be the Marvel universe versus the DC universe, and it gave birth to the Amalgam comics and all that kind of thing. Well, we all had to put house ads in, and so me and the team launched this series called Putting the Character Back in Comics, where we isolated the figure and had really cool typography and kind of defined each character, and we put them in. And I remember like hearing that DC freaked out because we had brought a campaign to these comics that were selling wildly in numbers, and we did a campaign and DC didn't, and that was the first issue, and by the fourth, DC had kind of put together a campaign, but no, our department did really well.
7 years at Marvel, doing ad campaigns and writing copy to promote other people's stories. All during that time, and I was just thinking about this, during those 7 years, was there anyone who wrote into you or looked to you for an internship or a job that would like, please be my savior, my mentor? Can you bring me in and help me up like you were?
Was it during those 7 years or after? I think some of it was during those 7 years, but there are a couple artists specifically that I've helped really get their way. I always meet people on mass transit. I guess that's the first thing. I've had a number of like mass transit meetings, that are unbelievable. Like I met Michael Uslan, the producer of the X-Men movies, on a bus going out to Montclair, New Jersey from New York. And we bonded over Johnny Quest, showed him something, project I was working on, and then he ended up optioning it. Like, it was crazy experience like that. But one of the guys, and I just saw this kid with a sketch pad, and he was sketching, and I really liked the art. It was cool and it was fun. It was closer to what art looks like today in comics than what art looked like then, because that was a point where, everyone was still trying to do a style that was almost post-image. It was like the Kubert years. But I met this kid. He was kind of a musician, but at the same time, he was going to SVA and he was interning at DC Comics, and we became friends. And I started hiring him to do early Foot Soldiers images for me, and kept on taking him out to lunch, and we just became friends. And that was Gerard Way, before My Chemical Romance, before Young Animal, before Umbrella Academy, all that sort of thing. And so he's one of those examples. Another example of a guy that I met at a convention, and this would be after that 7 years when Alex and I were going around and doing our first signings of Earth X. He kept on trying to get people to see his portfolio, and no one was really checking it out. And I had him do a story for me. I saw this young painter who was really talented. And plus, he just kept on, he'd send me communication in an email, and I'd answer him, and then he'd answer back. And so it was like one of these things in which it's like, okay, it's a real conversation. How can I help? And I end up I said, well, if you come out here, I totally believe in your work, and you should show all the Marvel editors what you're doing. And so if you come out here, I'll take you into the offices and I'll show you around, and I'll try to get Joe Quesada to see your stuff. And that was Paulo Rivera, who was still in college at the time. And so I'd have these intros with people, but I was like, always, okay, if I'm going to help you, you have to draw the Foot Soldiers first.
Well,
it's quid pro quo.
That's right. That's right. No, but collaboration does come from two people believing in each other at difficult times.
Oh, yeah.
Your collaboration with Alex Ross, was that something that was organic, or was it sort of, someone said, you guys do this together?
Oh, no. It was totally organic. And what's really interesting is when I started my job at Marvel Comics, one of the things I didn't expect to happen, but one of the great things that happened, was I was also sent out to the conventions. Because they would send the advertising people, they would send the promo people, because they would figure at least we would, know how to give a smile to fans. We would know images and how to show. And one of my very first jobs was taking Alex Ross around the convention and introducing him to people like, I think Wizard was just starting, but you had even companies like Amazing Heroes, I think, doing their magazines, and all these different comic-based magazines. And so I would take Alex Ross around to those things, and some of my first advertising copy was on Marvels. So we just became friends. And every couple months, I'd give him a call because I try to just keep every friendship I have, and I'd give him a call and, we just talk about the things we loved, and we both loved Machine Man. We both loved Kirby's Machine Man and would talk about how Machine Man was really Kirby's last superhero that he gave to Marvel. His last hero that he gave to Marvel, which is why I've always loved that hero. And then, well, we can talk about how the Earth X thing happened, but it was just really us working together. And then he saw in a Marvel fan magazine that I was writing, or a Marvel-based magazine, what was it, Marvel Vision. I was doing this 2-page thing in which I would find like one of the modern day artists, like I think Mike Allred did his version of Spider-Man, and I'd be like, okay, so here's the deal. Stan Lee's come into your office, or he's called you up and he's like, I've got this idea for Spider-Man. Of course, he'd be like, I got this idea, and he'd do that. And it's a guy who, he'd describe it, and then the artist would have to draw it without thinking about Kirby, without thinking about Ditko. And what happened after the first couple segments is it kind of stopped being about 60s, and it became, if you were going to do this character, what would that look like? If you would do this character, what would this look like? And the versions that came up seemed so distant from what we all knew of the Marvel Universe that now they demanded, it's like they demanded a different origin. And so I started using, you'd have the image on one side, and I started using the page that you would put the text in the copy to write an alternate version of the story. And Alex became such a fan of those. Like I remember Jeff Smith did The Silver Surfer.
Jeff Smith from Bone.
From Bone, yeah. He did The Silver Surfer, and Alex called me up after reading it, and he said, I read that, and I felt like that should be the origin of Silver Surfer. He's like, this is one of my favorite things I read every month, and blah, blah, blah. So then all of a sudden, I wasn't just promoting Alex. He was seeing something, and I had already had books like Foot Soldiers come out and a couple other things come out, fortunately, while being able to keep my staff job at Marvel, which was really tricky and not always pleasant or easy, but it was really tricky. But all of a sudden, we're talking about ideas, and we were talking about ideas, and then this was right after Kingdom Come had come out. Wizard Magazine approached Alex and said, look, you did these really interesting versions of what the DC Universe would look like in 30 years. Could we do an article where you just do sketches of the Marvel Universe? And so Alex did a bunch of sketches, and he said, okay, here's something we can finally work on. It's just an article, you'll do that paragraph you do for Marvel Vision and do a paragraph for each of these. And so I got to write these little poignant things like the Spider-Man who's overweight and doesn't care because now in a world where everyone has great power, he no longer feels great responsibility, and stuff like that. And so I wrote all this stuff. It went in front of Marvel's president, and then all of a sudden the president was just like, okay, let's do this as a real project.
Isn't that interesting that it goes from idea to some kind of development to a sort of different kind of larger development to a very important story, and then, of course, another story and another story. And it seems to me you took a meta idea, which seems to be a common theme with you, a sort of world within a world, an alternate world, a Elseworlds before Elseworld.
An underworld. Like, I want to tie all of Marvel continuity together, especially in Earth X. We went crazy with Universe X and Paradise X.
Well, creating universes.
Yeah.
Which is what Jack Kirby did. Creating sort of, hey, let's not just do a character. Let's not just do a few characters. If we're going to do it, there has to be roots to the tree.
Yeah.
And of course, that leads to much bigger ideas. Having known you as long as I have, the ideas that come out of you, whether they come to fruition or not, are, to me, it seems to be the heart of your creativity. You have it's almost like no filter. You come up with an idea and it comes out. I've heard a lot of podcasts recently about feelings of rejection and how that freezes people up because they're worried that people won't like it, or they say it and a person of power doesn't like it, and then they retreat, thinking, well, that's never going to happen again. And the person that they talk to, it's not that it's just the timing wasn't right, or that wasn't the right person to talk to.
Right.
Whereas knowing you, as long as I have, you continue to be thematic and talk about things. And, I've been thinking about this.
Yeah.
Or you watch something and you go, hey, I watched this thing again, and, I think I realized something. And like, we're in a room right now where the wall is all the crawl from Star Wars. And we were sitting here and you read the last few lines, which is, custodian of the stolen plans that can save her people and restore freedom to the galaxy. And you go, I think I just realized that this was Leia's story. That this was Leia's story all along. It should have been. And
it should have been Leia's story. Leia should have become the one who the Force was born in. And, especially if she's the sister of Luke, the Force would be strong in both of them.
It's an idea whose time had not come yet. I mean, it's there now and they're pursuing it. But in the late 70s, I'm not so sure that people were ready for a female-driven hero in an adventure story, and they went towards the guys and the guy action figures and the guy. It was a male adventure story, but
the way even Empire works and Return of the Jedi works is good. I have qualms about Return of the Jedi, but I like the fact that Luke starts out yearning to be a hero, and then because every story is about change and the struggles to change and all that kind of thing, by the end, Luke is on the road to becoming a villain. And that's cool. Like, that's the right kind of story.
Right. I'm interested in, because we talked about collaborations and the creation of universes, Earth X, Universe X, Paradise X. And then, of course, you two work together again on Justice.
Yeah.
Which, for those of you who don't know, is an extremely important DC Comics book, which won the Eisner Award for Best Graphic Novel. If you haven't read it, rush out to my comic book store.
Blast off.
So again, the collaboration continued. Was that something that DC said, hey guys, can you do this, please?
Pretty much so.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it was pretty much so. I think at the time, DC was launching or trying to develop the All-Star, their All-Star brand, because they had the Batman one that was Frank Miller and Jim Lee, and they had All-Star Superman, Grant Morrison and Frank Quitely. And so we were originally going to be part of that, but then Alex definitely didn't want to do another origin story. And so there was some, are we part of the All-Star or not? And ultimately we just came out as our own thing. But
so it was supposed to be All-Star Justice League.
Yeah, so it was supposed to be All-Star Justice League and kind of a Justice League origin.
Right.
But that's not really the story that Alex really wanted to tell. And the more we talked about it and planned it, it felt like, Mark Waid had done such a great job with his JLA Year One, that it was like that story just got told.
And it was very recent, that story at that time. You do a lot of writing outside of the big two, and your books are generally, other than Foot Soldiers, which I think eventually became like you're doing OGNs, you're doing original graphic novels.
Right.
Rather than here's a periodical and it's coming out monthly and you have 6 issues and then we put it into a trade. You started making the jump into original graphic novels before a lot of other companies committed to that. What's your preference and what's your feeling on the future of original graphic novels as opposed to monthly periodicals?
I like both. I like really long narratives. I've been reading Daredevil on a monthly basis through good times and bad times, and I like that long story. Sometimes that's what makes, I think, in an era right now where we are, in which there are lots of people trying to create comic books that become Hollywood movies. We'll see the OGN until Hollywood's like, kind of, I think we got everything we could out of that industry.
Right.
If that ever happens. But I mean, the benefit of doing an OGN is you can just tell that whole story right there. If you're doing it on, and I would call even a periodical, if it's a limited series or something like that, that's an OGN. It's just being distributed in bits until the whole story can be collected. But it's really the long narrative versus the short narrative, or the movie. This is the first thing, even if you do a sequel to it. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
No, you are, absolutely.
It depends on the project, and because so many of us will do OGNs or limited series, especially if we're working with Image or a company where we're footing the bill ourselves, that becomes expensive. If you're working for the big two and you're doing something like Batman,
right?
Well, there have to be any number of Batman comics every month to support all the other interests in Batman.
There's another thing in retail, and I want to get back to this because with your work on Young Animal right now, doing the backup to Mother Panic, you're doing these short bursts. And of course, we're going, how the hell are they going to collect this? Is it going to be a separate graphic novel? Is it going to be, how are they going to do this with your part of it? Do you know yet? Is it?
I know what they're definitely doing, and I know what I'm hoping they're going to do.
Okay.
And I'll speak to both. I know that they're definitely putting all the backups. I think the first 6 issues of Mother Panic will come out as a trade, and the first 6 chapters of Gotham Radio will be in that.
Oh, okay. All right.
So they're going to do that, but
it'll be part of the page count.
Yeah, hopefully they'll collect all the Gotham Radio stuff at the end, as opposed to just having those issues.
I think it would be strange. It would cut up the narrative too much. I think it'd be great if it just, and people who are maybe the staccato nature of a little bit, it'll be much easier to see the vision of it when you have all of it page after page after page after page.
Right.
And you have your Gotham Radio story there.
And really, Gotham Radio, in my mind, I'm writing a movie. That's told in 3-page segments at a time.
Okay.
And so there will be 24 chapters to Gotham Radio. There will be a point, at the end of 12 that kind of feels like, ooh, that's the midpoint of a movie. It's that point where we've solved one thing. It seems like a victory. It seems like the goal has been attained. But then, of course, there's so much more, and you realize that that victory is not a victory.
This is a good segue into, because we talk a lot about movies. You talk a lot about movies. You're a cinephile. You watch things over and over. You go to movie theaters like the New Beverly, places like that, to Cinefamily, to watch things on big screens again, and the experience of it. You're someone who studies the nature of film.
Right.
You were also a director. You directed a film.
Yeah.
And you were part of, I think it was NYU, was it?
Yeah, I went to NYU Film School.
Film school.
Yeah.
But you did that when? How old were you when you went to NYU Film School?
I had just left my Marvel job. So I'm around 30. I'm writing Earth X, and Earth X made some really great royalties.
Yes.
And there were bonuses involved at the time. And so I used those bonuses to go to NYU.
Which is interesting because mostly you see kids going to NYU right out of school.
Right.
And to learn, you said, oh, I'd like to do this as something else to expand my career.
Well, and I thought it would make me a better writer, and I felt like what had happened in the time of working at Marvel and starting to write Earth X was I had optioned Foot Soldiers as a movie. I've optioned Foot Soldiers so many times, which is good.
It is good.
It's always
and
ancillary money.
It's still available from Image. There was a new printing from Image for all of you listening.
Oh, good.
It's really a wonderful book, and
thanks.
I love how it was. It's a post-apocalyptic superhero book, but these kids who dig up old pieces of
superhero
powers, and they walk in the shoes of not the superheroes that lived, but the superheroes that died.
Oh yeah, it's got all my love for.
There's
Tim Burton,
and it's a world.
Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah, you created a world.
It's darkness and it's fun. But what had happened between this advertising career that I was working on and now really excelling at Marvel, and then all of a sudden writing Earth X, which was not all of a sudden, it was 7 years, is I had written a couple comics. I had Foot Soldiers optioned by Michael Uslan of the and I think his company was called Bat Film at the time.
Right.
But the idea is that if you option one of your properties, people get the rights to try to make it in a movie or try to get something going on it for like a year, and that year lapsed. So Michael came back to me and said, look, Jim, I want another year option. I'm not going to pay you any money this time, but what I will do is teach you how to write the screenplay yourself, because I think you could be a writer of film. And so we spent that next year writing that screenplay together.
Interesting.
And so I was learning this, and I was learning this new way of approaching story and this new way of not using exposition, because there's so much exposition in comics. Comics require exposition in ways that a film doesn't. And we can talk about that because I love talking about that. But all of a sudden, this was a different way to tell a story. And so that was really exciting to me. And I was like, okay, well, let me try to do everything. And that led to me doing NYU.
And
so it felt like an organic, again, next step of moving forward.
And the movie is called They Might Be Dragons.
Which is awesome.
And tell us about the story.
The story is about a guy who's just lost his job and is convinced that part of the reason he lost his job is because his boss is a dragon. So the first shot really is him buying a gun, and he's going to hunt down his boss and kill the dragon and save us all. Not because he's been fired or laid off or whatever, but because his boss is a dragon. And in the midst of tracking the boss down to an underground garage, we get his internal monologue that kind of builds on the idea that his belief, crazy as it is, might not be so crazy. And it was really fun. I got to shoot in New York, and what's great in New York is that you see lots of things that don't necessarily belong, and yet in the giant collection of everything they do. So my shot list was, walking in front of the Atlas statue of Atlas holding the world on his shoulders as we see our hero, thinking that it all falls upon him. At the time, there were these giant spider exhibits, these giant spiders that were right in the middle of Rockefeller Center. So I had him following his boss underneath these spiders and constantly using the world that actually was to suggest that there's lots that we don't know of going on all around us.
Right.
Until the final confrontation.
Not just dragons. It's a fable, a fantasy, dark fantasy.
Oh, sure. It's totally Don Quixote.
And to me, reading High Cost of Happily Ever After, which is also a fantasy-based book.
Right.
And a sort of turning a fable on its head and telling the story in a different way. And even The Runner, which is another one of the original graphic novels, to me it's a dark fantasy story. There is some kind of connection here with, I don't know if you write your comic book scripts like this for your artists cinematically, where you describe these particular elements, or you give your artist sort of creative license. Do you do that?
Well, I've definitely seen an Alan Moore script, and I do not write an Alan Moore script.
I don't know how many people write an Alan Moore script.
Alan Moore pretty much so will type a page, an entire page of description per panel.
Yeah, I was talking to Dave Gibbons, and Dave Gibbons said how he approached it was he had two versions of the script, and one of the versions he took a black Sharpie, and he blacked out all of the description, and so only the action was there. So it was, he goes to the door, and then black, 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 black. He opens the window, black, black, black. And then he had the other script with all of the notes in the margins and all the stuff that he did. And that was the only way he could approach it, to go, okay, here's what happens in the 9-panel grid. So I thought that was, fascinating. But
yeah,
your
I'm
scripts,
sure that's necessary.
Your scripts, are you directing? Are you directing the cinema in your script for basically the cinematographer to do the shot?
And to a degree, one of the ways like a screenplay would be different than a graphic novel or a comic book script is that in a screenplay, you would never say, we're going to pan out from this and pull out and blah, 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 because that's stepping on the director's toes. Mm-hmm. And any director who would read your script would be like, who is this novice? That's offensive. But in a comic script, you're always breaking the fourth wall and speaking to the artist. It's perfectly fine to say, okay, I want a tight, crop on a phone, pull out from that, and we see that Peter Parker's in the room, and then pull out even further, we see the things coming off his head because his spider sense is tingling, and then in the fourth panel, the phone rings,
Right.
So he knew the call was going to happen before stuff like that. Like, you could just do that, and the artist is still going to interpret it. So it's almost like in a graphic novel script, the artist and the director share a co-director role, or the writer and the artist share a co-director role.
I've met a lot of comic book artists that say they like that. They enjoy, give me more information. The more information, the better. I want to know what to draw because I'm not writing this thing, I'm drawing it. And more specifics, the better. And then within that framework, I can, maybe mess around with you want the Spidey sense to be coming off. I might want to do the Spidey sense in a little bit of a different way than other people do it. It's not just a squiggly line. And that's interesting. But I also heard from Joe Casey when he was working with Ashley Wood on Automatic Kafka. Ashley Wood was far away on the other side of the world, but his interpretations of things were very different. And one of the issues was the character was walking in a hospital and his script said a beautiful, provocative nurse comes out of the room and steps in front of him. And then it was like late, the art was late, and it was just before press, and he finally sent the pages in the days when they were actual pages and not computer art. And the nurse steps out, and she's half naked from the waist down in a nun habit, in high heel black shoes. And that's what they had to work with.
Yeah.
And of course, they canceled the book before the last issue came out.
Right.
But I think, there's a limit to creative license, of course.
Right. And hopefully part of that is you're working with an artist who understands what you as a writer are bringing, and you're working with the artist, and there's a collaboration between the two of you. And that's always my advice to writers, as a writer, especially early on, you're so afraid of notes. You're so afraid of collaborating. It's got to be this way. That you limit how good your project could be by looking at this single project as your only shot, and it's got to be exactly the way you envision it. Every project changes, and it's got to change for it to become better.
So the idea that perfection is limiting, that if you try to be perfect, you might never finish anything.
Well, and I wouldn't even call it perfection. I think it's our pride limits us. Our vision of what perfection is limits us, because it can always be better. And as a writer, we shouldn't be taking pride in our ideas. We should be taking pride in the finished project, which is us being involved in the collaboration, or recognizing when an artist really brings a great idea and telling them, that was awesome.
So there's a place for ego in creation.
Oh, yeah.
And then there's also a place where ego hinders.
Yeah. No.
Flow of creation.
And ego has to always be put in the right place, or else the project's dead.
Right.
Or we're not as good as it could be.
Looking at your work, it's not just fantasy and fable. What I see as a through line is myth. The Joseph Campbell thing, the hero's journey, and creating mythology behind everything, which again is world building. Mm-hmm. But myth that goes, far back to the heart of stories, meaning the Greeks, the Bible, the Quran, all of the tomes that essentially are morality tales, which is what comic books are. They're good and evil, and hero's journey, and the good wins in the end. Sometimes the villains win, but eventually they get their comeuppance. It's just the journey to get there. How? Because I know that you have a background, you have a religious background coming from your family. How has that injected itself into your work? Your focus on mythology and the heart of storytelling, no matter what, whether it's graphic novels or cinema. Is that something that you think helped you in some way?
Well, I think what's helpful is I knew a lot of the classic stories growing up. For as many times as maybe my parents took me to church, I watched Wonderful World of Disney, and so I would say that even it's probably not the faith they would have exactly wanted for me, but the faith I grew up with was one that was mixed with monsters and fairy tales and that sort of thing, and really looking at and always delving into what's the iconic, what's the great story here. And so the ones I want to write, the ones I try to write, are ones that always go to, okay, what's the biggest dramatic issue? What's the biggest loss potential? What's the thing that's going to take my character and change the character into the hero? And I mentioned Luke Skywalker before. I think best stories are the stories where the hero, even if he's already a hero, he's not the hero who can save the day at the beginning of the story. Like, the hero has to go through some sort of pain and suffering and be transformed by that pain and suffering so that they can be the hero necessary to save the day. That's why I love Sin City so much. Even the first movie, because Sin City is at least for those 4 first ones that Frank did, they're always the story of someone who does not know love, ultimately being affected by a love they know doesn't even belong in that city, and that transforms them and gives them courage and changes them in a way we're not used to, like changes them to the point where it's not just taking one bullet for the person that they love, even if it's a really like screwed up love, but they take all the bullets. And those are great stories.
Well, you're describing street level stories. I mean, you a lover of Daredevil.
Oh yeah.
And of course you did a little Batman writing.
Yep.
And it's got to be said that you are kind of a great description of what a Batman writer should be, because you seem to always look for the humanity part of things. You have a hero that can move the planet, but yet you go, why? Why?
Wait, are we talking about Superman now?
No, I'm talking about what you do.
Oh, yeah.
Because you've done Superman as well.
Right.
You look to the human.
Yeah.
And you have Batman, who it's all about really under the cowl.
Oh, yeah.
And what drives him in his mind and the choices he makes. It all stems from an event that transforms him into something else. Right. So what you're describing is the human hero's journey. Forget the cowl, forget the gadgets, forget the ability to,
Right, because we don't need another Batman fight scene. like in the great, years and years of Batman comics and how many come out every month, we don't need another Batman fight scene. We want a Batman fight scene. I'm not saying we shouldn't have a Batman fight scene, because they're always great. But if there isn't something else there, the fight scene is just a fight scene.
Right.
And then it's just about which artist is the best.
Yeah, Alan Brennert talked about that as well. He talked about his time on Batman, where in a fabulous version of Batman.
Oh, that collection is so great.
It is.
And I feel good because I was one of the ones like Kurt Busiek and Mark Waid petitioning DC to put that collection together.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the humanity part of it, the sort of, well, what if it went in a different direction? What if he made a different choice as a human being? And how would that affect him being a superhero?
Yeah.
Even you writing an Adventures of Superman story. Okay, I'm going to do a Superman. Hey, Jim, do a Superman story for us. And you're like, great. Okay, so the story's about this Green Lantern who comes to Earth and says, I was the Green Lantern who was supposed to save Krypton, and I didn't. It becomes a story about something else entirely.
Oh, yeah.
Because we've seen Superman have a fight that, is epic and destroys cities, and we've seen this. What we haven't seen is this extraordinary conversation.
Oh, yeah. And, even in that Green Lantern story, I wanted a Green Lantern to speak to Superman and say, in the name of mercy and justice, kill me. I'm responsible for the deaths of your people.
And I've been carrying this with me.
Yeah.
The weight of this.
So he's got selfish motivation, and Superman didn't ever expect to have to face this, So
and
it was
then
cool.
has to make a human choice.
Yeah.
And it's like Max Landis did a story recently in American Alien where he's fighting Lobo, and Lobo is saying, I used to kill Kryptonians all the time. I got skulls of Kryptonians. You guys were, meek, pathetic, and glad your world died. And, they're fighting, and it's a terrible thing. And then he's talking about Krypton. And then, of course, Superman beats the hell out of him and says, I'm not from Krypton. I'm from Kansas.
Awesome.
And it's
so
just,
awesome.
Wow. It's just like, I've embraced my humanity here. So this sort of thing doesn't work on me.
Yeah. And that's why even American Alien worked so well. There was so much humanizing in that.
Yeah. You talked about moving through something, putting yourself out there over and over, trying something. What stops people, it seems to me, and is the biggest villain that we have, is fear. Fear is the great, sort of the brick wall for all of us, and having to move through that fear. And I just heard a quote that was, if you're not scaring yourself, you're not working hard enough. And it's a thing that I feel is appropriate in that you're constantly attacking the idea of story. Not, I'm doing a comic book. I'm writing a movie. I'm writing a story. What is the story? What are the elements of the story? We'll work out the schematics of it later. But right now let's talk about the human part of it. And I wonder if you could tell us of a time where you have been sort of, fear has stopped you. Fear has sort of limited the thing that you were working on or doing, and how you moved through it, what you did to push yourself forward.
Yeah, you know what? I almost have to respond by saying I don't think I'm ever afraid of the stories I'm writing. When I approach a story, I see it in bits and pieces, like puzzle pieces, except that I'm creating some of the puzzle pieces to fit these elements together. My fears are usually, am I going to make rent this month? Is my son going to be okay? Are my parents still healthy? It's like, those are the fears that will distract me from writing stories. But usually when I get down on it, I never write until I've walked around and paced around with the story and kind of figured out the main bases of it. I would say that the fear feels like the idea of writer's block. And, I don't think I have that. But maybe if writer's block is the bad version of something, maybe there's a good version of it that I also lack. So like that two-sided coin, like maybe, I don't know, what's the opposite of writer's block? Caution, or working at something on a daily basis. I tend to, my rule of thumb is that the best days are days in which I read something, watch something, and write something. And
Right.
I've told plenty of writers that that's the goal. But a lot of times I'll spend a day just watching something and talking with a bunch of people and doing meetings and all that kind of thing. And then there are other days where I won't read anything at all. I won't watch anything at all, but it'll just be, I'm on this assignment. But the goal is always to do all three. And I would say that those are the things that stop you from having writer's block. Maybe this is a better answer. I think hopefully if life is working the way it needs to work and we want life to work, every time we go through bad things, I mean, maybe we never want bad things to go through, but when we go through bad things, the temptation is always to think that we go through them in vain. That there's nothing in that, it's just a bad thing and we're never changed by it. But if life is working the way it should, we are changed by it. And there was a point in my career, definitely before High Cost of Happily Ever After, probably even after I had started doing Foot Soldiers and so doing Earth X, but there was a point in my life where kind of everything needed a restart. Everything was lost. Even friendships and family experiences or family relationships were really strained, and some were broken. And it kind of transformed my writing and changed the way I approach heroes always. And I even mentioned this before, but I had always written the Tom Sawyer, the John Constantine, the character who could outsmart the bad guy but never went through anything bad himself. And so I never wrote stories about people changing. And therefore, none of those stories maybe had what they could have had. Or I look back at earlier stories and I'm like, oh, if only I had done that, if only I had known this. Maybe the blocks, as you talk, a block, it wasn't a block like you face with a white page where you're just, oh, what do I write? How do I begin? It was more like, how do I make this story resonate in a way that it matters to people? I think you can begin to see this in Justice when it asks the question, why don't superheroes stop suffering, the suffering of mankind? What is that question? I wasn't even quite there yet with Earth X, but I was just fortunate to love Captain America so much and to fear that, and to look at him being the kind of the champion of democracy, and to think that, well, what happens when democracy goes wrong? You have mob rule. And so what was fun about writing Captain America and Earth X especially was to tell the story of a man for whom mob rule, the democracy he had always fought for, betrayed him, which is why he's killed by a mob in Universe X.
Right.
Right. Only to be transformed into something else for Paradise X. But it's always about, for me, because I've experienced real change in my life, it's always about, how does this character change?
How do they
can they
reborn
change?
in some way?
How can they become what they weren't before?
Well, that's comics. You come back from the dead, but you come back just a little bit different than you were before.
You know what? I wish that were the case. I
It's
really
not. They
wish.
just go right to the same old costume and the same.
Even if there's a costume change, it always goes back. I wish that we were so dedicated to our continuity that if a character died and came back, they were different from that point on.
Yeah, yeah.
And you dealt with all the storylines of people, even friends, being like, you're different.
Well, the old school way, the Julie Schwartz way, was like, okay, in this world, when somebody dies, they're dead. And that's the powerful part of it. Like, we have this other world where people come back to life. But in this world, in the old world where people get old and they have kids and they die. And somebody else takes over for them. Those days are gone. I think in comics, it's like you can't ever expect that anybody is dead forever.
Yeah, what's great about what Julie's saying there is that death should have consequence. And right now, death doesn't have consequence.
Right.
And that's why I'm like, okay, bring him back. I don't mind the character who lives and dies and comes back and dies again and comes back and dies again. Like, it's almost like that's a heroic journey that's building to something even bigger.
Right.
But there's no consequence when they come back. There's no emptiness. There's no like one of the reasons I love season 6 of Buffy, to go back a little bit, is when Buffy's brought back to life, she's telling Willow and all her friends, I was in heaven and you guys dragged me out of that.
Right.
And she's kind of never the character she was again for the rest of the series.
Yeah.
And that's what it allowed death to have its consequence, and then allowed resurrection to have its consequence.
Right.
And that was cool. And that's how our story should be, I think.
Consequence is a big thing. I think maybe more in Marvel than in DC, because as you've said before, in Marvel you have human characters trying to deal with the fact that they have superhuman powers now in this normal world. And then you have DC where people have godlike powers and they're trying to figure out how to be human.
Yeah.
And I remember reading the 9/11 issue of Spider-Man when J. Michael Straczynski was writing it. And it was so powerful, like this image of there's Spider-Man flying through the city, and it's like there's no dialogue, and he gets to ground zero and all the superheroes are there with all the firefighters sifting through the rubble. And someone looks up and says to him, where were you?
Yeah.
And that was powerful to me because it was sort of like it was talking to all superheroes in Marvel Comics. How do you explain this in a city of superheroes flying everywhere, who can teleport from one place to another, who can move airplanes, who can stop things? How do you explain it? In one moment, it goes, this is a comic book, and this is real life.
Yeah.
And it's okay for us to sit and go, okay, for a moment, let's recognize real life.
Right.
And then get back to our regularly scheduled programming.
Yeah.
I thought the courage of that
Yeah, no, that was awesome.
was really great. I wonder if you talked about your family and the things that you went through, your father and your husband. You had a lot of things in your past that were, had turbulence in your personal life. Now it seems you have there's a happiness about you, a sort of calm. I know you have worries and fears like everyone else, but as a husband, as a father, your children are thriving. You seem to enjoy your time with them. I'm a father too, so I know what that feels like. How is that informing your work? Do you think that your work has changed based on the fact that maybe there's a little less turbulence than there used to be?
I guess I go back to this idea that I've always, like, the one thing in my entire life that hasn't changed is I live with hope. I live with optimism. I always have. Like, this was a compliment, but like when I went through a divorce, my mom, in a very Midwestern Bobby's mom way, said, "Oh, I'm just glad it was you and not your brother."
You sure she wasn't Jewish?
It's a compliment. It's a compliment. And my wife, whose voiceover could do the voice perfectly, but in the end, she was like, "But you have hope. You have optimism." And what I'm seeing now is that sometimes we want results immediately, and that's just not how it works. Like, I've been restored. One of my children, my daughter, has been restored to me after 10 long years of having been blocked from me and kept from me.
Right.
And now she's with my wife and I. It's unbelievable. And, it's like one of the great stories of just my life, that I hold up there next to being held at gunpoint, spending a night in an Ohio penitentiary, lecturing at the White House, blah, blah, blah. But it's one of those pivotal. How did that happen? Getting to write comics, getting to work in movies and animation. How did that happen?
I want to get into the mechanics of something, and that is, here's the question. How do you write? And by that I mean, are you a computer writer? Are you a notebook writer? Do you use pens? Are you someone who thinks about things and you puts things on note cards and then puts them all together like a puzzle? What is your process, and is it different for every different form of writing?
I definitely break down a story in a notebook. And then I kind of get on my computer. I rarely do note cards, but I'll get at my computer and I'll kind of break it down into, I have page 1 to page 3 to do this, page 4 to page 5 to do this, page 6, and I'll break that down to just kind of, these are the scenes, these are the scenes, these are the scenes, these are the scenes. And then I break that down further to, these are the pages, these are the pages, these are the pages. And then break that down to, and usually it's changing along the way. Ooh, I need more pages for this. Or I have a new idea and I'll be like, I'm going to move this scene earlier because I think it'll work better for overall flow. So I always do kind of the big picture in my notebook. And then I begin to big picture and break everything down. So I usually script at the end.
Right.
Except when I'm writing a screenplay. Or like a pilot, I mean, it's still the same process. It's just, what's helpful as a writer is to embrace, this is helpful for writers. A lot of times when we begin, we don't want it to be like every other comic book, like every other movie. We reject all the rules of structure. But when we do that, we're not left with a story at the end. The only way to really be creative is to work within the structure, to work within the system of how a story is told. Because this is a system. This is, story structure is something that's been developed over, like the history of mankind. And so when we're like, "Whoa, I'm going to do it differently," and stuff like that, we're kind of betraying everything. And when everyone comes into a movie or to a comic book, they're expecting a story. There's both the desire to have their minds blown by some great idea or something they never thought of before, while at the same time wanting the comfort of this kind of structure.
There's really, all the stories have been told in some way or another. Yeah. So you're telling a story not in a different way, but like seems to me you approach the person telling it. And what is their story?
Yeah.
And how does that affect this story that we know we've heard before, but it changes because of the person who's involved in it, who's motivated by it, and we're really following them as opposed to the story itself. So do you know the endings before you
always
begin?
know the endings.
Always
know the endings.
Okay.
Because because if I'm going to write a character's story, I know who they are at the beginning, and I need to know who they are at the end. Because everything else is about how do I, I have both God complexes and Satan complexes. How do I, as a writer, move them from this point to this point in a way that people reading it are enthralled and excited and are fearful and hopeful all the way to the end.
You're very similar to John Irving, my favorite contemporary novelist.
Awesome, thanks.
He says the same thing. I begin at the end, and that I know where when I'm driving, I know where I need to end up, because that's the most important. He also talks about adapting Cider House Rules from a novel to a film, and how it's such an epic, sweeping novel. And it was the first time he was writing a screenplay, adapting his own work, and he kept trying and trying and trying, and there was just absolutely no way for him to get everything in there. And so he went to them and said, "What kind of movie do you want?" And they said, we want romance. So he said, "Okay." And he adapted essentially one chapter of his book, the most romantic, and focused just on that part of the story. And that was the whole movie. So you watch the movie and you go, "Oh my God, it's missing so much from the book." There's the Academy Award. It's like he said, "I'm going to throw away the fact that it's a novel. And I'm just going to focus on one part of the story that has power to it."
Right.
The ability to work within a framework, but jettison the things that you're used to and be fascinated by the process.
Right.
And I was also, I went to the first reading of, Neil Gaiman did a reading of Ocean at the End of the Lane at the Alex Theater.
Oh, awesome.
And there was, 600 people there, and there he was, and Jeff Boucher was moderating, and wonderful conversation with people emailing in, and all these famous authors who were emailing in and trying to pretend like it wasn't them. And then he revealed that I did a second book that's actually coming out a week later, which was his children's book, but nobody knew. And he said, "You want me to read some from it?" And everybody, "Well, of course." And he pulled out from his backpack a beat up spiral notebook, like this red spiral notebook, things sticking out of it and sticky notes. And he started reading. Jeff Boucher said, "I'm sorry, that's the book?" "Yes." "Is that the way that you work on your books?" He said, "Absolutely. I go and I sit in coffee shops and I walk around and sit in park benches, and I write the book out in a notebook and make notes in the margins, and I stick things in there. And by the time I sit down to the computer, I'm just transcribing." There's really no way that I can look at a computer screen and develop in my imagination, develop the way that I do with my hand and a pen and a piece of paper. Very similar to what you're talking about. The process of first I put my soul into this physical thing. And as a paper merchant, I can tell you that paper is important. And then you go to the next stage. You know, I wonder if it'd be an interesting lesson in film school or writing classes or whatever to say, you have to write in a notebook for a while. We're going to make you write this next thing in a notebook.
Well, and I think that's the idea of the note cards and putting note cards up on a wall and making sure that that you have all the scenes balanced within the act structure and all that sort of thing.
Even if they can't write something completely in a notebook, you're writing little things.
Right.
Either way, putting it into, and not using the note card function in a screenwriting program.
Right. I don't know how you write just sitting down at the computer. Though, well, no. See, I was thinking, did I do that Earth X-wise? And I was like, no, I pretty much had all these ideas jotted down.
Do you keep those notes?
I probably don't have the Earth X ones anymore, but I have maybe 5 or 6 notebooks that are just filled from beginning to end. And it's really interesting to look at them because you'll see that, you know, this would be this idea, this would be this idea, and there's lots of ideas that I haven't even used yet, but sometimes I go back to or something like that. But then in the midst of it, there's some sort of phone call I need to deal with and all these personal notes of my life. And so I look at when I was generating these ideas and what was happening in my life at the same time too. And that's interesting for me to look back on. I mean, it's almost like a similar version to, I guess, journaling, but it has nothing to do with what's actually going on in my life. I can just mark the stories I was coming up with based on kind of the other conversations I was having.
I often talk about how in the store we don't sell comics, we sell memories, and how each individual comic book is so powerful to the reader because they remember who they were, their bicycle, what they wore, the girl they liked, what their parents were doing during that time. So many memories, like a great photograph when they see the comic book before they even read it.
Oh, yeah.
So thinking about it in a different way, how powerful must it be for the writer and the artist and the letterer, the people who created this thing, this memory? For you had to create it during a time in your life, not just read it, but make it. And looking back at all of these different things, not just, you know, the video games that you've developed, as a director of a musical or whatever it is, these experiences that you had. Comic books are a form of writing. It's an actual physical thing. Yeah. So you can remember, you know, the Rockettes, you can remember, but the actual comic book is a photograph. Yeah. You can pick it up and thumb through it.
I think like reading comic books and being part of this, and this goes back to the OGN idea versus just the long ongoing narrative. You know, I think we attach our lives to long narratives. You know, it's like even a religious thing. It's like we attach, I think all faith is somehow based on people attaching their story to a bigger story. And I think that's why, you know, there's so many of us who have read comics since we were kids, still 30, 40 years later reading them, still caring about the characters, still hoping that this run of books is going to be as good as the Frank Miller run or the Bendis run or something like that.
And attaching the linear, their own life story to, you know, Daredevil's life story. Yeah.
In fact, you know, I remember even thinking, this goes back to the Miller. I remember even some of the focus of that final, you know, well, it wasn't the last thing he did, but when he did the Born Again series, which I still consider probably Marvel's greatest book ever, the Daredevil Born Again. The whole lesson of it is Matt Murdock losing everything, and he kept on saying, never give up, never give up, never give up. And I remember moments of my life even thinking about that and being inspired by it and hopeful because of it.
Yeah, I just interviewed Quentin Peoples, and I like referencing my other podcasts and stuff, but his ultimate description of why comic books still hold sway over people's lives, whether they're just readers or creators, is here is the epic storyline, here is the mythology, and in the end, love wins. It always ends at that.
Yeah.
And when it doesn't, it's sort of a betrayal.
Yeah.
So I like to ask a couple of questions, but one that I do this with everyone because I love time travel so much.
Mm-hmm.
So I ask these questions about time travel. There are moments in your life, we all have them, that we, as opposed to just, I'm going to travel back in time and I'm going to live my life differently. Something that you and I as people we run into a brick wall because we have children and we choose another path and those children don't exist. And that's unacceptable to me anyway. I have a feeling to you as well. But there are choices that we make throughout our lives and they stay with us. They sort of haunt us a little bit. Are there things, is there something or a couple of things, maybe just one thing in your past, in your life that you can go, I wish if I had a chance, I might have made this different choice, knowing what I know now, in order to take that piece of that haunting out of my mind, because I just want peace of mind. It would help me to achieve more peace of mind.
Oh, yeah, no. No.
No, nothing.
Yeah, I don't know if peace of mind isn't necessarily something I struggle with. I mean, I certainly have struggles, but peace of mind. I mean, if I go back and I'm like, oh, I wish I had known this sooner. I wish I had known this quicker, or learned this quicker. Then, yeah, I wish I had understood the nature of collaboration sooner. You know, like even Foot Soldiers, when it first launched at Dark Horse, you know, I think if when Dark Horse, and that was a really dark time for comics. I mean, that was a point where books and whole companies were going out of business, and Dark Horse still put me out there. Brand new writer, brand new artist, brand new property. No one had ever heard anything about us, and they still put me out. I think if I went back and I was like, pretty much so, as long as people were talking about stuff, it's better. That's what I've learned. Like I was really upset when the book turned from a 12 issue to a four issue project, and I got my rights back right away. But I go back to that moment and I say, you know what would have been how would it have been different if I wasn't so anxious to get my rights back, and if I had spent some time like talking to Mike Richardson, talking to the various people who were there. And even though editorial was like, yeah, Jim, no, you're doing the right thing, get your rights back, make sure. So much can be fixed by people just talking it out. And I feel like creators working with editorial teams, not being afraid of notes, working with editors and publishers, and because ultimately we all want to do great work, and we all can't do great work in collaborative ways if we're not all recognizing that from each other.
So basically, the mechanics of communication.
Yeah,
that's something.
The idea of sticking it to the man, especially when you're working, that's never helpful. It's never helpful.
Again, ego seeps its way in.
Yeah.
So with the calm that you have and the idea that you have peace of mind, is there some spiritual practice that you have? Maybe a personal question, but a spiritual practice that you have that keeps you grounded and helps you on a daily basis to approach things with peace of mind and a lack of fear and a little bit more of maybe finding the joy in things?
Yeah, I always assume that the world's a lot bigger than I am. And whenever I get some sort, like if I get a negative email from an editor giving me lots of notes, or even a friend or someone I'm working on something, if there's something that doesn't seem right with them, I now don't assume that it's my fault or that I've done something to upset them.
You assume the best.
I assume that
first.
Well, I assume that there's something else going on in their lives.
Right.
And it's just coming out in this way towards me. And that allows me to keep on working, not get what's going on, or what's wrong, blah, blah, blah. I just assume that, and look, I follow up all the time. So it's very possible that it's me, but I just don't.
The term was fall up.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to clear that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I assume that it's not necessarily my fault until I know it's my fault. And I have no problem saying I'm sorry. So,
So that's an intellectual, emotional pursuit. Spiritually, which is something that people get a little uncomfortable talking about. Spiritually, is there a spiritual practice? Do you meditate? Do you go to church still? Do you take quiet time in your day before you write? Do you go on walks to clear your mind? Like, what is a practice that you do?
Oh, I see. Yeah, I walk a lot. I'm a little out of practice of hiking here in LA, but I loved hiking in LA.
And you used to run, right?
Yeah, I used to ran a couple marathons, but it's more like what I do is I make sure I play every day. I don't, and maybe this has been to the detriment of my career, but I make sure I don't work a full day. I just don't.
So you give yourself structure with your work, so that at some point in your day, the hard work ends and some play begins to, so that you can get inspiration.
If I did hard work that day, let's, to be fair.
So sometimes your play ends, and so that you can do some work.
And there are words, there are words like catchphrases or something like that I will remind myself of all the time. And I find almost like when these catchphrases hit me, it's usually because some sort of zeitgeist is affecting everyone. Like a number of years I saw from rugby, from Ralph Lauren's rugby line, which they don't even have anymore. I saw this T-shirt they put out that just had a really simple anchor that said "Hope on, Hope ever." I was like, oh, I'm going to grab onto that "Hope on, Hope ever." I'm just going to continually preach that to myself. Like I preach to me more than I hear anyone else preach to me. But I'm going to hold on to that. I'm going to think about that. And I'm going to research that. And I found out that there was this old hymn that sailors would sing called "Hope on, Hope ever." And the words were all about being in the middle of storms, being in the middle of everything, thinking that you could drop an anchor and it would never hit bottom. Like people on the verge of death. And I'd be like, "Hope on, hope ever," and it would become a part of my thinking. And then 6 months later, I started seeing anchors everywhere. And it became like all of a sudden I think we're at the end of it, but there was maybe a year in which there were so many more anchors being used. And so I always look at stuff like that and I'm like, I think I practice awareness in the same way.
That's wonderful. And I think I'd like to end on this phrase that you just said, "Hope on, hope ever." Thank you for joining us and for giving us your words of wisdom. I think a lot of people out there will really appreciate what you've sent out into the world.
Oh, good. Thanks.
The Blast Off podcast is produced by the Colonel, Jeff Fox, Scott Tipton, and me. Original music is composed and performed by Derek Anthony Gray. You can find more of his musical compositions on his website, DerekAnthonyGray.com.
For more information about anything you've heard us talk about today, check us out online at blastoffcomics.com. We have an active Facebook presence, so check us out over there on Facebook. And you can reach us on Twitter at blastoffcomics or on Instagram.
Or you can come by our retail location in North Hollywood in the heart of the Arts District, 5118 Lankershim Boulevard in North Hollywood, just 2 blocks south of Magnolia. See you soon.